The streets of London were painted in soft hues of amber and gold as autumn made its quiet entrance. Leaves rustled beneath the polished shoes of William Ashford, a man who seemed to glide effortlessly through life, on the strength of his reputation and wealth. At just 41, William was the head of Ashford Holdings, a financial empire that spanned continents. To the outside world, he was invincible. But behind the walls of his pristine office on the 30th floor, there were cracks, and beneath his tailored suits and measured smiles was a man battling a war of his own making. The echo of his footsteps filled the marble corridor as he made his way to the penthouse suite. It was late, far later than usual. He had been delaying going home, finding excuses to stay at work, because home wasn't home anymore. Not since Evelyn left. She had been the light in a life William hadn't realized was so dark. Until she was gone, the key slid into the lock, and the heavy oak door creaked open. Silence greeted him, the kind that settled into the bones and stayed there. He stepped inside, setting his briefcase down with a dull thud. The place was immaculate, the kind of order that didn't come from living, but from absence. He loosened his tie as he wandered through the rooms. They were exactly as they had been the day Evelyn left. Nothing out of place. Everything just as she had left it. Her books still lined the shelves. Her scarf still draped across the back of the chair where she'd last sat. William poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He sipped slowly, his gaze fixed on the grand piano by the window. Evelyn had played it often, her fingers bringing warmth into their cold, minimalist world. Now it was just an elegant piece of furniture, silent and untouched. A soft knock at the door startled him. He frowned, glancing at his watch. It was nearly midnight. He crossed the room, setting his glass down with a deliberate care, and opened the door. A young woman stood there, drenched from the rain, her hands clutching a thin folder to her chest. She was out of place here, in this world of glass and steel. Her clothes were simple, her shoes scuffed, but her eyes, they were fierce, determined. "Mr. Ashford," she asked, her voice steady, but carrying something deeper beneath it, pain perhaps, fear, hope. He studied her for a long moment. "Yes, my name is Clara Bennett," she said. "I believe we need to talk." He hesitated. He wasn't in the mood for surprises. Not tonight. But something in her expression made him step aside. She entered quietly, dripping water onto the pristine floor as she moved. He offered her a towel without thinking. She took it with a murmur of thanks. "What is this about?" he asked, but not unkind. She placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it. Photographs, documents, and then a birth certificate. William stared at it, his mind sluggish at first. The name leaped out at him. Evelyn Ashford, mother. And under the line marked, Feather. His own name. The room tilted, but he didn't move. He sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on the paper. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Evelyn never had a child." Clara nodded, her expression tight. "She did? A daughter." He shook his head. "No, I would have known, but she didn't tell you," Clara said gently. "She couldn't." William stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The rain streaked the glass in thin lines. His mind raced back over memories. Every conversation, every moment. Had there been signs he hadn't noticed, or maybe hadn't wanted to? One, he asked, his voice sharp. When was she born? Clara opened a second page. 7 years ago. William closed his eyes, his hands clenching at his sides. Evelyn had been distant in those final years. Withdrawn. He had blamed it on stress, on the pressure of his world crushing hers. But this changed everything. She died before I could tell you, Clara said softly. I was her friend. She asked me to protect her daughter. Where is she? William demanded, turning to face Clara. She's with me, Clara said. But she's your daughter. He ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. Why now? Clara's gaze was unwavering. Because she deserves to know who she is. And because Evelyn wanted you to be part of her life, even if it took you time to find out. The silence stretched again, heavy and suffocating. William felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Her name, he asked quietly. Lily, Clara said. Lily Ashford. The name echoed in his mind, foreign and yet painfully familiar. He thought of Evelyn's smile, of the warmth he had lost. And now, the daughter he never knew he had. I want to see her, he said finally. Clara nodded. Tomorrow. William stood there long after she left, staring at the folder, the photographs, the life he hadn't known existed. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a sense of possibility and fear. As the rain softened against the windows, he poured another drink. But this time, it wasn't to numb himself. It was to steady his hands. Tomorrow would be the start of something he couldn't yet name. But he knew this much. He wouldn't run from it. Morning arrived slower than usual, as if the world itself sensed the weight of what was to come. William Ashford stood at the window of his penthouse, staring out over the city skyline. The light from the rising sun spilled across the buildings, bathing them in hues of gold, but the warmth of it barely reached him. He had spent the entire night without sleep, his thoughts spiraling between disbelief and guilt, between confusion and something that might have been hope. He turned away from the window and glanced back at the folder Clara had left the night before. It still sat on the coffee table, unopened since he first closed it. He wasn't sure why he hadn't thrown it away or demanded more proof. Something about Clara's expression, calm, unwavering, yet carrying sadness, had planted a seed in him that he couldn't ignore. It was as if, for the first time in years, his carefully curated world was showing him the one thing he had forgotten how to believe in. A second chance. He adjusted his tie as he left the penthouse, each step carrying more weight than it should. His chauffeur was already waiting outside. William didn't speak as he climbed into the back seat of the sleek black car, only giving a simple nod toward the driver, who merged quietly into the flow of traffic. The city moved around them as if nothing had changed, but everything had. William felt the dull thud of his pulse in his ears, his heartbeat heavy, deliberate. He didn't know what he was walking into. He wasn't prepared for the possibility that this could all be a cruel mistake, or worse, the painful truth. Still, he couldn't stop himself. He wasn't a man who believed in fate, but there was something pulling him forward now, something that wouldn't let him turn away. When they pulled up in front of a modest townhouse on the Lower East Side, William's breath caught slightly. It was nothing like the world he knew. No marble floors, no uniformed doorman, just a quiet street lined with small homes that spoke of simpler lives. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his jacket as if it could protect him from what he was feeling. Clara opened the door before he could knock. She stood there for a moment, searching his expression, before stepping aside and motioning for him to enter. The home was warm, filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and something floral that he couldn't quite place. There were books stacked on shelves that leaned slightly, worn rugs covering the wooden floor, and the faint sound of music playing softly from an old radio in the corner. It was nothing like the sterile luxury of his penthouse, and yet he found himself strangely at ease. Clara led him to the living room, where a young girl sat on the floor, coloring quietly. Her hair was dark and soft, falling in loose waves around her face, and her small fingers gripped the crayons with quiet focus. "Lely," Clara said gently, "there's someone here to meet you." The little girl looked up. Her eyes, those blue eyes, met his, and for a moment William forgot how to breathe. It was like staring into Evelyn's gaze, but softened by innocence, by youth. Lily tilted her head, slightly curious, but not fearful. She smiled politely, as if greeting a stranger at a party, and then stood, wiping her hands on her jeans before walking over to them. "Hello," she said, her voice light and clear. "Are you my uncle or something?" William felt the faintest tug at the corner of his mouth. "No," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I'm your father." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she frowned, as if trying to make sense of something she didn't quite understand. "I thought Daddy was the man in the pictures," she said, glancing at Clara. Clara knelt beside her, smoothing her hair back gently. "He was someone who helped take care of you for a little while," Clara explained carefully. "But William is your real father. Your mother wanted you to know him." Lily blinked slowly. She looked back at William, her expression thoughtful. "Did you love Mommy?" William's chest tightened painfully. "Yes," he said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Very much." Lily nodded as if weighing that answer. Then, after a long pause, she took a step closer. "Do you like ice cream?" The question startled him, but he found himself smiling. "Yes," he replied. I do. She considered this for a moment longer. Okay, she said simply. You can sit with me then. And just like that, she walked back to her coloring books, sitting cross-legged on the floor. William glanced at Clara, who gave him an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath and lowered himself onto the rug beside Lily, feeling stiff and awkward, but somehow lighter than he had in years. For the next hour, he listened as Lily talked about her favorite colors, her school, and the stray cat that sometimes visited their garden. She told him about the stories Clara read at bedtime and how she missed her mom, but knew she was watching from heaven. William didn't speak much. He just listened. And as he did, he realized something profound. In all his years of building empires and commanding boardrooms, he had never truly listened to anyone the way he was listening now. Later, Clara brought them tea and small sandwiches. William watched as Lily eagerly picked the crusts off her bread, her little nose wrinkling in concentration. He smiled softly. There was something disarming about her, something that stripped away his defenses without even trying. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Clara walked him to the door. She's not ready to understand everything yet, she said quietly, but she's open. And that's something. William nodded slowly. I want to be part of her life, he said, his voice low but certain. I don't know how, but I need to try. Clara studied him for a moment. Evelyn would have wanted that, she said finally, but you'll need to be patient. I can do that, William replied, and for the first time in years, he believed it. As he stepped out onto the quiet street once more, he realized the world hadn't changed. The city still pulsed with its endless rhythm, but he had changed, and something told him this was only the beginning. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the universe had slowed its pace just enough to let William feel every emotion he had spent years avoiding. Each morning he found himself waking before dawn, restless, his mind tangled in memories of Evelyn and the echo of Lily's voice in his ears. There was a time when his life had been dictated by precision, meetings scheduled down to the minute, contracts signed in silent, air-conditioned rooms where emotion had no place. But now everything was different. His priorities had shifted, though he wasn't quite ready to say the words aloud. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about connection, and that terrified him more than he expected. He made a habit of visiting Clara and Lily at least twice a week. At first, the meetings were short, an hour or two spent sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, coloring between the lines as Lily told him about school or showed him her favorite picture books. He listened more than he spoke, and it wasn't long before he found that listening to her was something he craved. She would glance up at him with her bright blue eyes, asking questions that were both simple and profound. Why is the sky blue? Did you always want to be a dad? Why did mommy have to go away? Each one hit him like a blow he didn't see coming, but he answered them, carefully, honestly. And Lily listened too. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Clara suggested they visit the park. It wasn't Central Park, with its sprawling green lawns and elegant fountains, but a small neighborhood park tucked between two apartment buildings. The trees were nearly bare, their last golden leaves clinging to thin branches. William had dressed in his usual tailored coat, polished shoes, and expensive scarf, but as he watched Lily running toward the swings, her laughter rising into the cold air, he realized how out of place he looked. Clara noticed too. She smiled as she pulled a woolen hat down over Lily's head, her gloved hands gentle. She's getting used to you, Clara said softly, falling into step beside him as they strolled toward the benches. I don't think I'm used to me yet, William admitted, his breath clouding in the cold air. This isn't who I've been for a long time. Clara gave him a sideways glance. Then, maybe it's time to change that. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he watched Lily pump her legs as she swung higher and higher, her laughter wild and free. There was something about the way she moved without fear, without hesitation. He envied it and he wanted to protect it. The feeling was unfamiliar, but it settled deep in his chest, undeniable. Afterward, they bought hot chocolate from a small stand on the corner. Lily insisted on extra whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. William took his plain, but as he sipped, he found the warmth spreading through him had little to do with the drink. It was the first time in years he had stood on a street corner, paper cup in hand, not rushing anywhere, Just being weeks passed and slowly, things changed. Lily began to call him Dad, at first by accident, then with intention. The first time it slipped out, they had been building a puzzle together at Clara's kitchen table. She'd placed the final piece with a proud grin, turning to him without thinking. "We did it, Dad," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. William froze for a fraction of a second, then smiled a real smile, and ruffled her hair gently. After that it became natural, and every time he heard her say it, something inside him healed a little more. One evening, as snow began to fall gently outside, William stood by the window of Clara's home. The tree in the corner was small but carefully decorated with handmade ornaments. Lily had insisted on showing him each one. Clara sat quietly on the sofa, sipping tea, her eyes watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You're different," she said quietly. William turned toward her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Different from when?" "From when Evelyn knew you," Clara said gently. "From who you were before," he nodded slowly. "I had to be then. Everything was about the company, about success, about control." "And now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, it's about Lily." Clara smiled faintly. "It was always supposed to be." He thought about that for a long time after he left that night. He returned to his penthouse, staring out at the city lights, and for the first time he felt lonely there. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt hollow. The rooms too large, the marble too cold. He realized he had spent years building walls, and now he wanted to tear them down. A few days later, William made a decision. He called his attorney and began setting things in motion. He had no desire to control Clara's life, or Lily's, but he wanted to create something secure for them, something permanent, a trust fund, a home if they wanted it, options for Lily's education, no matter what path she chose. It wasn't about making up for the years he had missed, because some things could never be fixed. But it was about showing up now. And he was determined to do that. The first time he mentioned it to Clara, she was hesitant. "You don't have to do this," she said. "We've been fine." "I know," he replied, "but I want to." She studied him carefully, as if trying to see through him. After a moment, she nodded. "Okay." And with that one word, he felt something lift off his shoulders. That weekend, they all spent the day together at the Natural History Museum. Lily's eyes grew wide as they walked beneath the towering skeletons of dinosaurs and stared up at the stars in the planetarium. She held his hand the entire time, and when she asked if they could come back again soon, William promised they would. Later, as they sat on a bench near the exit, Lily leaned against his arm. "I wish Mommy could see us," she whispered. William's throat tightened. "I think she can," he said softly. Lily smiled then, her head resting against him. And in that moment, he realized something simple, but profound. He wasn't just learning how to be a father. He was learning how to love again without conditions, without fear. The city outside was the same as it had always been. But for William Ashford, ever the snowfall grew heavier as December crept closer, blanketing the city in a quiet stillness that William Ashford hadn't noticed in years. There was a time when winter in New York had felt like just another season to conquer, another quarter to close, another strategy to refine. But now it felt different. Each morning, he found himself pausing at his penthouse window, watching the white flakes drift down and settle on the rooftops below. It reminded him that time was passing in small, delicate moments, and for once, he wasn't in a hurry to outrun them. Lily had taken to calling him every evening before bedtime. Sometimes it was to tell him about her day, about something funny a classmate had said, or a picture she'd drawn. Sometimes, she just wanted to hear his voice. William wasn't used to that kind of simple need, and yet, he found himself waiting for her calls in the quiet hours after his meetings were done. His phone would ring, her name lighting up the screen, and he would smile before he even answered. It was something he never imagined himself doing, and it filled a space in his life he hadn't realized was hollow. One Thursday afternoon, Clara called him instead. Her voice was hesitant at first, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be reaching out at all. "Lella's been asking about her birthday," she said. "She wants you to come." William felt a jolt of surprise, followed by something warmer, something he wasn't sure how to name. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "I wouldn't miss it. The party was small. Just a handful of Lily's friends from school, a simple cake Clara baked herself, and paper decorations taped to the walls of their apartment. It was nothing like the lavish events William had hosted in his world, where guest lists were carefully curated and every detail was a demonstration of status. But this was different. It was genuine. It was real. He arrived with a gift carefully chosen after wandering through a toy store for nearly an hour. A telescope. Not the most conventional gift for a 7-year-old. Maybe, but he remembered how fascinated Lily had been by the stars at the planetarium. When she opened it, her face lit up in a way that made his chest ache. She hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck as she whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." The word still felt new to him, but he didn't shy away from it. He embraced it, and he realized then, standing in a room filled with balloons and laughter, that he didn't need anything more. This was enough. After the party, Clara invited him to stay for dinner. He hesitated for a moment, old habits urging him to make excuses. Meetings, deadlines, things that had once seemed important. But instead, he nodded. "I'd like that." They ate simple food at a crowded table, passing plates and laughing at Lily's stories. William found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't thought possible. He listened as Clara spoke about her work, about the challenges of balancing everything on her own. He admired her strength, her grace, and he wondered how she had managed to stay so grounded when life had dealt her so many blows. Later, as he helped wash dishes in the small kitchen, Clara leaned against the counter, watching him with quiet amusement. "I never thought I'd see you here," she admitted. William glanced at her. "Neither did I," she smiled, but there was something else behind her eyes. Something softer. "You're doing good, William," she said. "Lily's happy. And that's all I ever wanted for her." He nodded, drying his hands on a towel. "It's all I want too." The weeks that followed were filled with small moments like that. They weren't dramatic or life-altering, but they mattered. He found himself showing up at school recitals, standing at the back of classrooms during parent-teacher meetings, and learning how to braid hair after watching a YouTube tutorial that made him curse more than once under his breath. Lily laughed at his clumsy fingers, but she never asked him to stop trying, and slowly he got better at it. But not everything was simple. There were days when Clara seemed distant, her eyes shadowed with worry. William didn't press her at first. He respected her space, knowing she was used to handling things on her own. But one evening, after dropping Lily off from an afternoon at the museum, he found himself lingering at the door. "Clara," he said quietly, "if there's something wrong, you can tell me." She sighed, rubbing her temple. "It's nothing you need to worry about. Let me be the judge of that." He replied, his tone gentle, but firm. After a long pause, she relented. The rent on their apartment had gone up. Her hours at work had been cut back. It was a common enough story in the city, but to William, it was unacceptable. "Let me help," he said. She shook her head immediately. "Don't want charity." "It's not charity," he insisted. "It's a family. And you're not alone anymore." Her eyes softened. She didn't say yes right away, but she didn't refuse again either. And within a week, he made sure she and Lily had a place they could call home without fear of losing it. It wasn't a penthouse, and it wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a better apartment, closer to the park, with a room Lily could fill with books and stars. One snowy evening, as they sat in that new apartment, Lily curled up beside him on the couch, tracing constellations in a picture book. "Mommy always said you were a good man," she murmured. William's throat tightened. "I wasn't," he said softly. "Not then." "But you are now," she replied. "That's what matters." He thought about that long after she fell asleep, her small head resting on his shoulder. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about building something new, something better, one moment at a time. Everything had changed. Winter gradually melted into spring, and with it came subtle changes that William found himself embracing more than he ever expected. Mornings that used to be filled with back-to-back conference calls were now often spent walking Lily to school, her small hand tucked into his as they strolled the city sidewalks, her chatter filling the air with an energy he hadn't known he was missing. She talked about everything: the planets she was learning about, the art projects she was excited to bring home, and the tiny mysteries of her young world that she trusted him to share in. It was these moments that made William pause and wonder how much time he had wasted chasing things that had never really mattered. Deals, mergers, negotiations. His empire had seemed like the greatest thing he had ever built. But now, sitting in a folding chair at a school recital, watching his daughter beam as she sang off key in a row of giggling children, he realized none of it compared. Clara noticed the changes too. At first, she seemed cautious, unsure if this version of William was one she could rely on. But as days turned into weeks, she relaxed in his presence. They found a rhythm between them, one that was both familiar and new. He offered to pick Lily up when Clara worked late, and she invited him to stay for dinner more often. Their conversations grew easier, filled with gentle teasing and shared memories. And sometimes, the silences between them said more than any words could. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Clara poured them both a glass of wine. They sat on the balcony, the sounds of the city humming softly below. William looked out at the skyline, then turned his gaze to Clara. "I missed a lot," he said quietly. "I spent years convincing myself it was for the best, but it wasn't." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You missed the hard parts," she replied. "The nights Lily cried and asked why her daddy wasn't there. The days I wondered if I was enough for her." She sipped her wine, then added softly, "But you're here now, and that counts for something." He reached over, covering her hand with his. It was a simple gesture, but it grounded him, reminded him that the past didn't have to be a chain around his neck. It could be something he learned from, something he used to be better. As spring unfolded into summer, life settled into something that felt almost ordinary. William took weekends off for the first time in his life, spending them at the park with Lily or helping Clara with small repairs around their apartment. He wasn't good at it. He'd spent too many years paying other people to fix things, but he was trying. And for once, trying was enough. One Sunday, they went to the beach. It wasn't a lavish vacation, just a day trip to Coney Island. Lily ran through the waves, squealing with delight as the cold water splashed over her feet. William watched from a blanket on the sand, a contented smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Clara sat beside him, her knees pulled up to her chest, her hair blowing wildly in the salty breeze. "She's happy," William said, more to himself than to Clara. "She is," Clara agreed, "because she knows you love her." He turned to her. "I never said it enough." "You're saying it now," she replied softly, "in all the ways that matter." That night, after Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat of the car, Clara rested her head against the window as they drove home. The city lights painted golden streaks across her face, and for a moment, William let himself hope. Not for the life they'd lost, but for something new they could build together. But life had a way of testing new foundations. One afternoon, William received a call he wasn't expecting. His assistant, Marie, had called him back into a meeting, one that was too important to skip. Investors were asking questions, his absence in the office had raised eyebrows, and decisions needed to be made. He sat in his car, the phone pressed to his ear, the weight of his old life tugging at him. "You can't ignore this," Marie said gently. "Not forever." "I know," he replied, his voice heavy. "But I'm not the same man I was." She was quiet for a beat. "Then prove it." He returned to the boardroom that day, but he was different. He made the decisions that needed to be made, but he did it without losing sight of what mattered. He refused late meetings. He cut back his hours. And when his partners questioned him, he made it clear his daughter came first. Not everyone understood. Some saw it as weakness, but William no longer cared. He had built an empire before. He could build a new one on his own terms. One warm evening in July, Clara invited him to a small neighborhood gathering. It was nothing like the high-profile galas he was used to. No press, no clients, no endless handshakes. Just neighbors sharing food and stories on a rooftop under string lights. He laughed that night in a way he hadn't in years, easily, freely. And when Clara took his hand and led him to dance, he didn't hesitate. As they swayed slowly, the music soft and familiar, Clara looked up at him. "You've changed," she murmured. "I had to," he replied. Her smile was soft. "I like this version of you." He kissed her then. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was patient, certain. And for the first time, He realized he didn't have to fight for control over everything. Some things were meant to be felt, not managed. As summer stretched on, William found himself waking early just to watch the sunrise with Lily. They sat on the balcony with blankets wrapped around their shoulders, sipping cocoa and talking about the day ahead. These were moments he never thought he'd have, and now he couldn't imagine his life without them. But part of him still waited for the other shoe to drop. He knew the past had sharp edges. That old wounds didn't always stay closed. One evening, Clara found him sitting alone on the couch, staring at an old photo he kept in a drawer. A picture of them, years ago, before everything had gone wrong. "You're not that man anymore," she said gently, sitting beside him. "I know," he replied, "but sometimes I wonder if I still carry parts of him." She rested her head against his shoulder. "We all carry parts of who we were, but it's what we do with them now that matters." And William believed her. He had spent so much of his life building walls. Now, he was learning to build something else. Bridges, connections, a family. And for the first time, he wasn't running from anything. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the city in deep shades of amber and rust. The days grew shorter, but in William's life, the moments felt fuller than they ever had. Mornings still began with Lily's small footsteps padding into his room, followed by her sleepy voice asking if he was ready to make pancakes yet. He wasn't very good at them. Clara often laughed at his uneven, misshapen attempts, but Lily always insisted his were the best she ever tasted, and somehow her saying it made him believe it was true. Clara's apartment, once a place William only visited, had slowly become something more, a home. His ties to his penthouse loosened with each passing day. It no longer felt like a retreat. It was simply space filled with things that once mattered. Now, most evenings were spent in Clara's living room, sprawled out on the couch with Lily curled between them, her head resting on his chest as he read aloud from her favorite books. Sometimes, Clara would fall asleep there too, her hand wrapped gently around his. And those moments, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, became the most precious hours of his life. But life wasn't simple, and William had learned enough by now to know that peace had to be fought for. One evening, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text, but an old-fashioned envelope. His name was written on the front in a sharp, familiar hand. When he opened it, his heart sank. His former partner, Vincent Hale, was calling in a debt, a favor William had promised long ago, back when they were still building their first deals, back when ambition blurred the lines of morality. Vincent wasn't a man you ignored, and this favor wasn't one that could be dismissed easily. William sat with the letter for a long time, staring at the words, feeling the pull of a life he had worked so hard to leave behind. He didn't want to bring Clara or Lily into this, but there were things he needed to protect them from, and this could not be ignored. Later that night, as Clara washed the dishes and Lily colored quietly in the corner, William stood on the balcony. The city stretched out before him, its lights cold and sharp against the dark. He ran a hand through his hair, debating whether to tell her. But before he could speak, Clara stepped out beside him. She always seemed to sense when something was heavy on his mind. "What is it?" she asked softly, her gaze steady. He hesitated. Then, carefully, he handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her eyes narrowing as she finished. There was a long silence between them. "You're not that man anymore," she said. "No," he agreed quietly. "But I was, and Vincent knows it." She set the letter down, turning to him, fully. "What does he want?" "A deal," William replied. "And he's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer." Clara crossed her arms, her face thoughtful. "So, you handle it? On your terms?" For a moment, William just stared at her. There was no fear in her voice, no panic, only certainty. And it was exactly what he needed. He nodded slowly. "I will." The next morning, William made the call. His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he'd used in every boardroom battle he'd ever fought. But this time, it wasn't about profit. It was about protecting the life he had found. Vincent was surprised to hear from him so quickly, but he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you back in," Vincent said, his voice low and demanding. "One last deal. After that, we're square." "One last deal," William repeated, knowing better than to trust him, but he had to play the game. For now, The following weeks were a blur of late night meetings and cautious planning. William told Clara everything, not hiding where he was going or what he was doing. She didn't approve, but she understood. And that was all he could ask for. Lily sensed something was different. One night, as William tucked her into bed, she looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. "Are you going away again?" she asked. His throat tightened. He promised softly, "I'm right here." And he was. Even if his days were spent navigating old alliances and dangerous promises, his nights were spent holding Lily close, reminding himself why he was fighting so hard to keep this life. When the deal was finally done, William sat across from Vincent in a quiet corner of an old cigar lounge. Vincent leaned back in his chair, smoke curling lazily around his face. "You've changed," Vincent said. "It wasn't a compliment." "I have," William replied. "And I'm not coming back to this." Vincent smirked, but there was something else in his gaze. Respect, maybe, or simple acceptance. "We all say that." William shook his head. "No, I mean it." And when he walked out of that lounge, leaving Vincent Hale behind, he knew it was over. Not just this deal, but the life that had brought him here. He wasn't going back. That night he found Clara on the balcony, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. She turned when she heard him, and for a long moment, they just stood there, no words, just understanding. "It's done," he said at last. She exhaled slowly. "Good." They sat together then, watching the sky darken, Lily asleep inside. William felt something settle in his chest, a quiet peace he wasn't used to, but he was learning. Learning to let go of who he had been, learning to trust the life they were building. As autumn gave way to winter, he found himself looking forward to things he had never thought he'd care about. Helping Lily with her school project, cooking dinner with Clara, laughing when he burned the pasta, decorating the tiny Christmas tree they set up in the corner of the apartment. One night, as they sat on the couch, Lily between them, her head resting on his lap, Clara took his hand and held it tightly. "You're here," she said quietly. "That's all she's ever needed." William nodded. "That's all I ever needed, too." And for the first time in his life, he believed it. Winter crept over the city slowly, frosting the edges of windows, blanketing the sidewalks in quiet drifts of white. William stood by the window of Clara's apartment, a mug of coffee warm in his hands, watching as the snow softened the sharp lines of the world outside. It was strange how peaceful everything felt, as if the chaos of the life he had once lived belonged to someone else. Clara was in the kitchen, humming softly under her breath as she packed Lily's lunch for school. He listened to the familiar sound, finding comfort in it the way it filled the space between them without demanding anything in return. Lily giggled from the living room, her small voice rising in excitement over a drawing she was making, and it struck William just how much he had begun to rely on these ordinary moments to ground him. There had been a time not so long ago when his life was a series of transactions, each relationship measured in what it could offer or take away. Power was his currency, control his sanctuary. But now things were different. He found himself waking early not to monitor stocks or close deals, but to make pancakes, despite still being terrible at it. He found himself laughing more, a quiet, unguarded laugh that Clara teased him about because it had taken her so long to hear it. And he found himself needing to stay in this world they had built together. Still, there were moments when the old life called to him. A phone buzzing late at night with a number he didn't recognize. A name mentioned in an article about the company he used to run. Temptations to step back into that old skin to wield power again, just to prove he still could. But each time, he chose not to answer, not to call back, not to look. Because he wasn't the man he had been, and he didn't need to be. Clara's steady gaze reminded him of that every time she looked at him like he was someone worth staying for. One night, as the snow thickened outside and the streets glowed faintly under the streetlights, Clara curled up beside him on the couch. She tucked her legs beneath her and rested her head against his shoulder, the familiar scent of her hair calming in a way nothing else was. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice low, warm. He hesitated, staring at the darkened glass beyond the apartment. "How I almost lost this," he admitted quietly. "How I almost didn't find it in the first place." She shifted slightly, so her eyes met his. "But you did," she said simply. You found it. And the way she said it, not like it was luck, but like it was a choice he had made that mattered more than he could explain. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. I did, he agreed. It wasn't perfect. There were still nights when he woke in a cold sweat, his mind replaying choices he wished he hadn't made. There were still days when doubt crept in, whispering that he wasn't enough, not for Clara, not for Lily. But then Lily would run up to him after school, her arms flung around his waist in a hug so fierce it stole his breath. And Clara would smile at him from across the dinner table, her eyes full of quiet certainty. And he would remember he was exactly where he was meant to be. They took Lily ice skating on a Saturday afternoon. She wobbled clumsily on her skates at first, her mittened hands clutching William's, as if letting go would send her flying across the rink. He held her steady, patient, gentle, something he was still learning to be. Clara skated nearby, laughing softly when Lily managed to take a few steps on her own without falling. It wasn't long before the three of them were skating together hand in hand, as snow began to drift lazily from the sky above. And for the first time in years, William felt light, like the weight he had carried for so long had finally lifted. Later, as they sat together sipping hot chocolate, Lily's cheeks red from the cold and her eyes bright with happiness, William realized something. He didn't miss the old life. Not even a little. The boardrooms, the cold power plays, the relentless climb, they had filled his time, but never his heart. This, watching Clara and Lily laugh together over marshmallows that melted too fast, this was what filled him now. And he wouldn't trade it for anything. But life, as always, had its own plans. It was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. Official, heavy, his old company's logo embossed in silver on the envelope. Clara found it first, tucked into the stack of mail. She said nothing, simply handed it to him, her expression unreadable. William stared at it for a long moment before opening it. It was an offer, not a request, an offer to return a position as chairman, unlimited authority. They wanted him back, needed him back, and everything he had once believed he wanted was laid out in black and white on that page. He read it twice, 3 times, then folded it carefully and set it down on the table. Clara said nothing at first, just watched him quietly, waiting. They want me back, he said at last, his voice low. They're offering everything. She nodded slowly. What do you want? She asked. And that was the question. What did he want? He stood there for a long time, the quiet hum of the apartment settling around him. Lily's soft singing floated in from the other room as she played with her dolls. Clara's steady breathing beside him grounded him in place, and he realized he already had everything, everything that mattered. That night, he wrote a simple reply. 1 sentence. Thank you, but I decline. He sealed the envelope, placed it back in the mailbox, and walked away. They celebrated quietly that evening. Not with champagne or grand declarations, but with a simple dinner, laughter, and the warmth of being together. Clara rested her head against his shoulder as they washed the dishes. You're sure? She asked softly. He kissed the top of her head, his hand resting against the small of her back. I've never been more sure of anything. And in the days that followed, as the snow melted and the first signs of spring began to creep into the city, felt something William he hadn't known he was missing. Freedom. Not the kind that came from money or power, but the kind that came from letting go, from choosing love over fear, from choosing family over everything else. He tucked Lily into bed that night, her tiny hand clutching his as she drifted off to sleep. Clara stood in the doorway, watching them quietly, her smile soft and knowing, and William realized he wasn't running anymore. He wasn't chasing anything. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Home. The early days of spring arrived quietly, as if the city itself had grown tired of the cold and the weight of winter. William found himself waking to sunlight that streamed gently through the windows, warming the hardwood floors of Clara's apartment, his apartment now too, though he still caught himself thinking of it as hers. He liked the way the light softened everything, casting a golden glow over the furniture, turning even the simplest mornings into something that felt peaceful. He wasn't used to peace. It felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Clara moved through the apartment in a rhythm that calmed him. She brewed coffee while humming softly to herself, her bare feet padding across the kitchen floor. Lily chattered from the other room, her voice bright with excitement about something she was drawing. William watched them both, quietly, holding his coffee in his hands and wondering how it had taken him so long to understand that this was everything. Not boardrooms, not titles, not power. Just this. He had thought it would be harder to walk away from his old life. But with each passing day, it felt easier, like shedding a suit of armor he no longer needed. He had thought the silence that followed would be uncomfortable, that he would miss the phone calls and the constant demands for his attention. But now, he found himself sitting by the window, listening to nothing more than the sound of birds returning to the city and feeling content. And yet, there was a restlessness, not the old hunger for power, something else, something quieter, the need to create something lasting, something of his own. Clara noticed it first. She always did. She had a way of watching him that wasn't intrusive but knowing. And one afternoon, as they sat on the couch with Lily asleep against his chest, she looked at him and said, "You're thinking about building something new, aren't you?" He smiled faintly because there was no point in pretending with her. "Maybe," he admitted, "but not like before." She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way she did when she was trying to figure out if he was telling the whole truth. "Not for power," she said softly. "For legacy," he replied, and he meant it. Not a legacy of dominance or ruthless ambition, but something different, something better, a foundation Lily could be proud of. A business that didn't just take you but gave something back. Clara nodded as if she understood without needing him to explain it further. And maybe she did. Over the following weeks, William began to lay the groundwork for something entirely new. He reached out to people he trusted, not the sharks he used to swim with, but those he knew shared his vision for something more ethical, something rooted in community and sustainability. He spent long hours at the dining table, papers spread out in front of him, sketching out ideas while Clara read quietly nearby. Lily would sit beside him sometimes, coloring her own business plans with crayons and glitter pens, insisting that any company he built needed to include an office dog and free ice cream Fridays. William laughed more in those days than he had in years. Real laughter, the kind that eased something deep inside him that had been tight for far too long. He met with old colleagues who were surprised to see him again. Some were skeptical of his change in direction. They thought he was playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to reclaim his empire, but they were wrong. This wasn't about reclaiming anything. It was about starting over, completely. The work was slower than he remembered, more deliberate, but it felt right. Every decision weighed not just for profit, but for impact. And that was something he had never cared about before, but now, it mattered more than anything. One evening, Clara found him standing by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker on as dusk settled in. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "You're different," she murmured. He turned, pulling her close. "I'm trying to be." She smiled, that soft, knowing smile of hers. "You already are." And he believed her. But the past has a way of lingering, even when you think you've outrun it. It came back one night in the form of a phone call, an unknown number. He debated ignoring it, but something told him to answer. The voice on the other end was familiar, cold, calculated. A man from his former life, someone who had once been an ally and now sounded more like a warning. "They're watching you," the voice said simply. "Some people aren't happy with the way you left." William felt his jaw tighten, though his voice remained calm. "I don't care." "You should," the man replied. "There's talk of digging up old things you thought were buried." He hung up without another word, his mind racing. Clara found him minutes later, his hands clenched tightly around his phone. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Ghosts," he replied quietly. "Trying to remind me who I used to be." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "You're not that man anymore." But he knew it wasn't that simple. The man he had been ruthless, ambitious, had left behind a trail of enemies, people who didn't believe in second chances or redemption. And they were coming. He could feel it. For the first time in months, sleep didn't come easy. He lay awake long after Clara had drifted off, staring at the ceiling, his mind filled with the weight of old choices. He wasn't afraid for himself, but he was afraid of what his past might bring to their door. He couldn't let that happen. Not to Clara, not to Lily. The next morning, he made a decision. He would confront it head on. He had lived in shadows oncey, but not anymore. If they wanted to come for him, they would have to do it in the light. He kissed Clara softly before leaving that day, his hand lingering on her cheek a little longer than usual. She watched him go, her eyes filled with quiet strength. And as he stepped out into the bright morning light, he felt ready. Not for battle, but for closure. The day felt colder than it should have been. Even though spring was settling over the city, there was a sharpness in the air that cut through William's tailored coat as he walked. Each step echoed softly on the polished concrete beneath him, his pace steady, his mind clearer than it had been in years. He wasn't walking toward power. He wasn't chasing something anymore. This time he was facing it. He had arranged the meeting himself. No intermediaries. No boardrooms. No pretense of civility. Just a quiet place, neutral ground far from the glittering towers, where deals were made and people were broken. He waited under an iron canopy at an old train station long since closed to the public. The paint was chipped. The tracks rusted. But there was something fitting about it. This place was no longer part of the machine, and neither was he. The first man arrived precisely on time. Gray suit, narrow tie. The kind of man William used to be, or maybe just the kind of man he had ordered around for most of his career. Then two others, silent, watchful. It was all so familiar, and yet it felt distant now. Like a life he had read about but hadn't lived. They greeted him without handshakes, without names. They didn't need them. They all knew who they were. One of them finally spoke. "We thought you were gone." William's gaze stayed steady. "You was?" "No." Back. Starting something new. A pause. He didn't deny it. Something better. There was a faint twitch at the corner of the man's mouth. Amusement maybe, or disbelief. "We don't like unfinished business, Crawford." The name felt foreign in his ears now, but he owned it still. He always would. "I'm not your business anymore," he said, his voice calm. "You don't just walk away," the man replied. His tone was even. "Cold. You know that." William took a slow breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs. "You're right," he said quietly. "You burn bridges or you build new ones." His gaze didn't waver. "I'm not coming back, and I'm not afraid." They watched him, those three men, and he saw it in their eyes, the calculation, the assessment, the subtle weighing of what it would take to destroy him. But they weren't facing the man they remembered. They were facing something else now. "You should be," one of them said finally. William's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, not quite. "No," he said, "I shouldn't." It was true. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them. Not of the things he had done. He had made peace with his past, not by pretending it hadn't happened, but by choosing something different. Every day. Every moment. They left first, silent as shadows. And when they were gone, he stood there a little longer, feeling the weight of it all lift. He had expected confrontation, maybe even violence. But what he got instead was something harder to come by, of understanding. They wouldn't bother him again. Not because they accepted him, but because they saw he no longer played by their rules. Later that evening, he returned home to find Clara and Lily curled up on the couch. They looked up as he entered, Clara's eyes searching his face quietly before she smiled. She knew. She always did. Lily jumped up and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy," she giggled. "You're home." He crouched down, holding her tightly, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "I am," he murmured. "And I'm staying." Clara moved to stand beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. There was a peace in her gaze that told him everything he needed to know. The storm had passed, for now, at least. Weeks turned into months, and the life he had rebuilt began to settle into something steady. His business grew, not fast, but strong. It wasn't an empire, but he didn't want one anymore. It was enough. It was honest. He hired people who believed in what they were doing, not just people chasing paychecks or status. And he paid them well, treated them better. He built something that gave back to the world rather than bleeding it dry. And through it all, Clara was there. She became his partner in ways that mattered far more than balance sheets or mergers. She helped him see things clearly when old habits threatened to creep in. She grounded him when the world tried to pull him back into its chaos. Lily grew too curious and kind, her drawings taped all over his office walls. Little bursts of color and imagination that reminded him why he had fought so hard to change. Sometimes she would sit in his lap while he worked, asking questions about the things he did, the choices he made, and he told her the truth. Always. One night, long after Lily had gone to bed, he and Clara sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked him softly. He thought about it. The power, the influence, the sense of control. And then he thought about everything he had now, the quiet, the love. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Not anymore." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Good," she whispered. And they sat like that for a long time, listening to the hum of a city that no longer owned them. The past was still there, of course. It always would be, but it was no longer his prison. It was a story he had lived through and survived. And now, he was writing something new. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. And in the end, if it wasn't wealth or power or revenge that mattered, it was the quiet moments, the ones that came without warning, when you realize you are exactly where you're supposed to be. Sometimes life breaks you, shatters everything you thought you knew, and then slowly it gives you the pieces back. Not to rebuild what you had, but to create something entirely new. Stronger, wiser, more honest. It's in those moments when you stop chasing, stop proving, and start living. Because the truest measure of a person isn't how high they climb, but how deeply they heal. And when you find that healing, when you finally let go of what was, you make space for what can be. And that is where the real story begins.